And the people who lived on that land, they have been expelled. The people in Gaza, they live in a concentration camp, now a death camp.
Piers Morgan, known for his sharp takes and fiery confrontations, thought he could control the narrative when he faced off with Professor Marandi on his show. But from the moment Marandi fired back, calling out Western hypocrisy, defending Iran's stance, and even labeling Gaza as a death camp, it was clear this wasn't going to be just another interview. Every attempt by Morgan to steer the conversation turned into a brutal counterattack, as Marandi tore into decades of Western interference, leaving Morgan struggling to regain his footing. Did this exchange just mark the end of Morgan's usual hard-hitting style?
The general view in the West is that Iran's attack on Israel was an abject failure. Whether or not it was a genuine attempt to wound the Israeli state or just a billion-dollar fireworks display, it didn't work. 99% of the drones and missiles were shot down by Israel's allies and its Iron Dome. Israel looks tough again, Iran looks weak. And after months of rebukes from its allies over the Gaza war, Israel's powerful friends have again made their allegiance clear.
Piers Morgan, known for his brash style and direct questions, entered his interview with Professor Syed Mohammad Marandi, assuming he'd guide the conversation. Morgan had a narrative in mind. Israel had supposedly shown its strength, while Iran's efforts had floundered, reinforcing the popular Western belief in the region's balance of power. For Morgan and much of his Western audience, this was an open and shut case. Israel, with the backing of the US and other allies, appeared strong, efficient, and almost untouchable, while Iran was cast as ineffective and desperate, unable to stand up to Israel's Iron Dome or its allies' support. But Marandi wasn't having any of it, and he wasted no time in turning this narrative on its head.
The position of the American regime is that apartheid should continue. Iran's position on South Africa had the same gap. There was the same gap back then, when the British and the Americans supported apartheid in South Africa and racial supremacism in the South African region, Zimbabwe today, and so on.
From the get-go, Marandi called out Morgan for pushing what he saw as a lopsided view, claiming that Western media is selective with its outrage. To Marandi, the story wasn't about failed missiles or an Iron Dome triumph. It was about the West's role in what he described as the genocide of Palestinians. He called it a calculated massacre, aided and abetted by powerful Western nations that, in his words, supported apartheid in Gaza by arming Israel and blocking any opposition at the UN.
What the West does to the non-Western world. When your governments were supporting Saddam Hussein, when your governments were arming him in the 1980s, before you turned against him, your governments gave him chemical weapons. I survived two of those chemical weapons attacks.
Morgan attempted to sidestep this point, pressing Marandi on Iranian missile attacks and suggesting Iran's role in regional aggression. But Marandi pressed harder, challenging Morgan to consider the broader history of Western intervention in the Middle East. He pointed directly to the Iran-Iraq War, where the West armed Saddam Hussein, even providing him with chemical weapons to use against Iranian citizens, including Marandi himself. Marandi wasn't about to be thrown off by Morgan's questions. He seemed to use every single one as a way to expose what he saw as the blatant hypocrisy of Western countries claiming to stand for human rights. For him, it was almost laughable. There were countries like the US and the UK which regularly talk about democracy and freedom, backing Israel even as it, in his words, turns Gaza into a death camp.
The view from Tehran is quite clear. You know quite well, I know quite well, your viewers know quite well, that the Israeli regime is carrying out genocide.
Marandi painted a stark picture, comparing Israeli actions to past genocides and branding Gaza as a concentration camp, where Palestinians suffer daily under brutal conditions. This wasn't just a heated opinion, it was a direct accusation, and Marandi wasn't going to let Morgan minimize or evade it. Marandi's core argument was clear: the same Western countries that openly criticize nations for supposed human rights abuses are heavily involved in supporting Israel's actions against Palestinians. According to him, Western nations are hypocrites, painting themselves as champions of justice while aiding and arming Israel's military operations and then turning a blind eye to the suffering in Gaza. He claimed Western media is part of the same story, giving extensive coverage to Israeli casualties while all but ignoring the ongoing Palestinian suffering.
Well, of course, since you support the Israeli narrative and you are a friend of the people who are carrying out this Holocaust, this ongoing Holocaust, and you don't care about the
I
people
don't support any
in the
narrative.
West
I'm
Bank.
just asking you
And
whether if
no,
it was
no,
being used,
that is,
if it was being used as a military base, was it a
you have,
legitimate target if they're training
you
Hezbollah
have,
to attack Israel?
you have a rather one of the most extreme narratives, and I think you're doing a disservice to truth.
To Marandi, this selective outrage wasn't just biased, it was dangerous, fueling what he called a Holocaust against Palestinians in Gaza. Every time Morgan tried to push back or change the subject, Marandi dug in deeper, turning the spotlight right back onto Western powers and their media allies.
What Iran has been doing in the last few years, if not decades, has been supporting via proxy groups like the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, funding and helping to train them to commit acts of war against Israel, firing endless rockets, and as we saw on October the 7th, committing an act of heinous terrorism.
Piers Morgan wasn't going to back down easily. He pushed Marandi, making it clear he wasn't about to ignore the events of October 7th, a day he described in brutal detail. Morgan emphasized the violence, saying that what happened was nothing short of an atrocity, with attacks on innocent civilians that included mass murder, kidnapping, and brutality. To him, this was not only indefensible, but in many ways amounted to a form of genocide. Morgan argued that groups linked to Iran, like Hezbollah and Hamas, had crossed all moral lines, and he was ready to put Marandi in the hot seat for Iran's continued support of them.
Which actually is the purest personification of the genocide that you're talking about. You don't condemn that.
You're being dishonest. There is no evidence.
No, I'm not.
There's no evidence of rape, and I ask your viewers to
Absolute
look
nonsense.
But Marandi didn't flinch. Instead, he saw Morgan's arguments as a way to divert the focus from the main issue, the suffering of Palestinians under Israeli attacks. Marandi quickly countered by challenging Morgan to present concrete evidence for the claims he was making. He accused Morgan of presenting a dishonest narrative that seemed more focused on demonizing Iran than on examining Israel's actions in Gaza. For Marandi, the Western perspective was heavily biased, painting a one-sided picture that overlooked the ongoing hardships faced by Palestinians. By turning Morgan's questions back on him, Marandi was suggesting that this focus on Iran's involvement was, in reality, a way for Western media to justify even more aggressive actions against Palestinians, allowing their suffering to go unchallenged.
The way in which you always frame things where the other and the non-Westerner is incompetent and incapable, and your fantastic Israeli allies are on top of their game. No, in fact, it was a major defeat for the Israelis and for the Americans.
Marandi didn't hold back when he described the harsh reality of Iran's position in the Israel-Palestine conflict. He framed it as a fight for survival against Western powers that, in his view, are determined to keep both Iran and the Palestinian people under threat by backing Israel's military aggression. To Marandi, this wasn't about Iran being the aggressor. It was about Iran defending itself in a region where the rules seem rigged in favor of Western allies. He argued that Iran's actions are responses to a constant Western assault on its interests, accusing these countries of creating instability to weaken Iran's position. One of his main points was that Israel's allies, with support from the West, have even gone as far as targeting Iran's diplomatic missions, such as in Syria, which he labeled outright criminal. For Marandi, these actions went beyond political rivalry. He saw them as a violation of Iran's sovereignty and proof that the West would resort to anything to prop up Israel's power in the region. Marandi condemned these attacks as attempts to humiliate and suppress Iran, pushing back against the idea that Iran is merely a provocateur. Marandi didn't see the recent Iranian missile launches as a failure at all. He called them a deliberate strategy meant to expose weaknesses in Israel's defenses. To him, those attacks weren't just random rockets, but a calculated move to drain resources from Israel and its allies. Marandi argued that Iran was sending cheap, outdated drones, little more than dirt-cheap decoys, that forced Israel's defenses into overdrive, spending billions to take down what amounted to throwaway missiles.
You're doing a disservice to truth by
Actually, I don't at all. I've been very critical of Israel, but I don't believe. Whenever I interview people who can't find it in themselves to actually say what Hamas did on October October the 7th. I always find it slightly incredulous then, whatever else they say. Because we all saw what happened with our own eyes.
People are not intimidated by you. That's the problem. You can intimidate some of your own people, but you can't intimidate us.
I don't want to intimidate anybody. I want to get to the... I want to find out. I'm just fascinated. Okay, let me ask you this.
Let me ask
Professor, I'm not trying to intimidate.
That is a diplomatic
No, you don't ask the questions.
Just like the
I ask the
British,
questions.
No, I'm answering your question.
Morgan, of course, wasn't buying it, dismissing Marandi's take as propaganda meant to paint Iran in a better light. But Marandi was steadfast, saying Iran's real purpose was to test Israel's military capabilities, carefully observing how Israel responded and gathering intelligence without putting their advanced technology on the line. This, Marandi claimed, was the real success behind the operation. It allowed Iran to collect valuable data about Israel's defenses without the financial or military risk that comes with full-blown warfare. Throughout the interview, Marandi challenged Morgan's claims by exposing what he saw as a deeply ingrained Western bias against Iran and the Middle East. Every time Morgan accused Iran of fueling instability, Marandi fired back with reminders of Western involvement in the region's most destructive moments. He pointed out how the West once armed Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons, which were then used against Iranians, and how the US and its allies continue to supply Israel with military support for strikes on Gaza. For Marandi, this wasn't just about the here and now. It was about decades of Western interference that had shaped the political landscape and caused countless lives to be lost in the process. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.